Welcome to the In Vivo Project podcast, where we talk about real world, real life experiences that empower men to embrace vulnerability so they can live life to the fullest. My name's Eric Peyton. I'm your host, and today I'm joined by Dr. Amy Anderson. Amy is a mom, speaker, consultant, and clinical psychologist. I froze up there for a second. But it's so good to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
Yeah. And I was thinking about it earlier today. We've known each other for 13 years.
Really?
Yeah.
13
Because,
now.
because I started working out at the treatment center back in 2010. That's where we originally met. And it's so cool because if you had told me 13 years ago that we would be sitting here and I would have a podcast and have been doing the coaching stuff for 8 years, I definitely wouldn't have believed it. So it's so cool to have you on board and get to talk a little bit. Today, I really wanted to, for the listeners out there, this is going to be more of a coaching / therapy session because I've been working with Dr. Anderson for about 4 weeks now on my own personal journey of looking at just trying to improve myself and be a better version of me, which also helps me be a better coach. So I thought we'd just jump right in. One of the first things you do when you're working with somebody is you give them the initial testing, which is, you want to talk about that a little bit, about what that is for the listeners?
I do a PAI with most every patient, and then I blueprint them. So I'm doing an intensive assessment with the PAI, it's a personality inventory, and putting that together to look for missing pieces.
Yeah. So it was interesting. When I took mine, I scored like low to normal.
Yes.
But the crazy thing is that, I wasn't expecting to be like off the charts, but I was having physical symptoms in my body from things that were going on in my life. We can dive into that a little bit more.
Okay.
But I wanted you to talk just a little bit why you thought that I scored the way I did, but I was still having symptoms in my body.
Right. I was not expecting it to be have the lower scales as you had, but most everything was normal to low normal. Your lowest points were emotional acuity and your highest point was trauma. Even so, they were in a normal range, right? But I wasn't surprised to see that you don't have anything that jumped out at me that says you have some mental health, right?
Yeah.
But clearly there's some trauma and your body's very well guarded, and that's what the test is revealing.
Yeah, yeah. And, I wanted to talk about the trauma today. Specifically, I had that trauma when I was 17 years old that it's always been hard for me to talk about. And I've talked about it in therapy, and I've went to intensives, and I've done a lot of EMDR around it. But I don't know, like this time when we talked about it and we wrote it out, it was different. So, the biggest thing for me was when I was 17, I was sexually assaulted by a nanny. And I think it's hard for guys to talk about something like that. And I think when it happened, there was so much shame and guilt around that that I didn't want to tell anybody about it. I was super embarrassed about it, but it really affected me, and I think it still affects me even to this day.
Right.
So, I didn't know exactly how we wanted to go with that, but it's definitely something that I wanted to say out loud and talk through.
I'm glad you did, because I have so many patients with similar experiences. Many male patients are sexually abused or sexually assaulted, and they don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's actually more common than we realize.
Yeah.
And I think you saying that makes sense too, also to your testing. So I mentioned a minute ago that your emotional acuity was your lowest point. And so that's in some way you disconnecting from the emotion that's related to the trauma. Your higher point was the PTSD. Despite you being disconnected, having compartmentalized, trying to survive this, your brain still has memory of it. It's still stored in your hippocampus, and your amygdala, which is your emotional response,
Yeah.
is still going to react, whether you ignore it or not.
Yeah, and I think that coupled, when I was 17, my parents got a divorce. It was very traumatic. I was the oldest of five, and I was actually the one that confronted my dad about the affair that he was having on my mom, and it's really like, even to this day, I mean, I love my dad. I love my mom, but because there was this disconnect and all this traumatic things happened at
one
that
time.
age, it's still today. I'll get to a point, especially if something traumatic happens in my life, where I'll revert back to that time period where I really didn't talk to either parent, and I think I don't feel like I'm alone in that. And I really that's probably the biggest thing when I came to you that I really wanted to understand, because not only has it affected my relationships with my family, specifically my mom and my dad, but it's also really affected my romantic relationships. And that's something to me that I really I desperately want to have a healthy relationship, not only with my parents, but a romantic partner. So I didn't know if you could touch on that and maybe just talk a little bit about that, how that process.
How that works
Yeah.
together. When you didn't go back to talk to your parents, when you find yourself making that choice, what is that about? How is it serving you?
I think it just protects me, because at that time period, I was a senior in high school. My mom packed up everything and moved to the other side of the country. And my dad was in a relationship. He was gone all the time. So I was literally by myself.
Just all of a sudden.
Yeah, by myself, from a family, a big family. Again, there was 5 kids, so a family of 7. And then all of a sudden, with everything that happened, I found myself just all alone a lot. I had friends, and, I had a car, and I was playing football. It was my senior year. But I look back on that time, and it lasted for a good 10 years where I just felt like I was by myself and I really couldn't depend on anybody. And if I did depend on somebody and they got too close, then I would start sabotaging. I think that's where it came up in romantic relationships. If somebody got too close, I would in my mind say, oh, this is eventually not going to work out. So I was using that frame of reference of my parents' divorce, and I think that trickled in.
And that was the message you got from it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
We were talking earlier about, when you're born your authentic self.
Right.
And our experiences, people, teachers, surroundings, they start to give us messages about who we are. So you already start having new messages about who you are as you're growing up. And then you hit that period of time at 17. You had a lot of trauma during that period. That was a hard year. And you developed messages from the assault about who you were. And then when your parents divorced and how they responded to you or reacted to you. And you carry those into your other relationships.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, most of the time when I ask people what those messages are, they can't identify them. And we even had some of those experiences, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It was really hard for me. I was really good, because part of your program that you do with people and your blueprint is you have them do their survival, what they do when they're in survival. And I was really good. I could not name those off. And there was a lot of them. But then when we got to the core beliefs, that's where I really froze up. And it was hard for me to even say things like connection, communication. I'm I'm trying to remember the other ones. Being assertive, being a leader, all those things were really hard for me. I think again because I've for so long I've bounced and stayed a lot of time in that survival mode. So I think
Yeah. That was so telling to me too, because having known you for so long, you are a leader and you're a connector. And you're sitting here telling me I pull away, I sabotage for my connections. I can't imagine what that is like, how lonely that would be if that's part of who your authentic self is. And then to identify your survival so quickly.
yeah,
And survival, by the way, are behaviors. They're the behaviors we resort to survive certain situations. So you start to feel like you're getting close in a romantic relationship or any relationship. And it can be scary to get vulnerable, so you'll avoid instead of connect like your heart wants to connect.
right. Yeah, and we talked about that too. I'm looking over here at the where we talked about my biggest fear was ending up alone.
Yeah.
And how the the solution to that is to be vulnerable,
Right.
which again, like I don't like this process of like writing it on the board. I've never done that in therapy before. A lot of times we just talk, right? So I love that part.
So seeing it's been helpful.
Yeah, it's been super helpful. And I knew that from doing this with my clients, but I've just never taken the time to do it for myself, to write it down. And I think the other thing, the big thing, the being able to really communicate my needs was something for me that was like super hard to do.
It was. Did that surprise you?
It did. It kind of did, but at the same time, one of my go-to things, and my survival mode circle over there is to just get real quiet and to disassociate and just be out of my body, and just at another place. And I think that for me, it's been hard to get out of that. It's like especially with the romantic relationships, or if something happens where I just go with the flow. A lot of what I do is go with the flow, and some of that comes from, I think that comes from growing up and being in a family of 5 kids,
That makes
and
sense.
it was kind of like a military kind of deal the way my dad ran it. So it was, his way or the highway. There was not much to talk about if you couldn't use your voice, right? And then also working with my clients. A lot of what I do with people sometimes is hold space, you know? So I don't confront them in the moment. I actually, I remember one of the biggest things you taught me when we were working together out at the treatment center was, hey, when something pops up, don't confront it in the moment. Give it some space and catch them while they're reading the newspaper, and then bring up that deal. So,
And that's a great core tactic. So some of what you're describing, the sitting in and listening, they can look really positive, right? And they can be very core and healthy and helpful. You can have some of those same behaviors in survival mode, and because they are so normal, like going with the flow is normal, you don't recognize that might actually be a red flag. I need to pay attention to that's actually part of my sabotage.
Right.
So one thing we've been talking about with this process is checking your agenda with that behavior. So when you're going with the flow, am I holding space, or am I avoiding something and giving in and placating?
right.
And that's where you can start to make some change too.
Yeah, no, I agree with
That
that.
makes
And
sense.
that's what I've been kind of playing around with that, because it's like you said, it's using a skill. And again, going back to the survival piece of that I stay in, and then going over to the core, it really is a check-in.
Yes.
Because sometimes I do feel like I don't say stuff when I need to say it. And then sometimes I say stuff when I don't need to say it, like it's not in the right timing. So I've really been
That's a
trying.
good example.
Yeah, I've been trying to work through that.
You're taking that pause. Someone said this morning, I heard this on a podcast actually, to have your last two steps towards something. And the steps could be speaking, right?
Okay.
Be your slowest. So that you're giving yourself that time to be intentional and to check in.
Yeah. So pausing and, and that's the other thing too, is that I have not been the greatest at like really thinking through stuff. And some of that I think will come from journaling, which we were talking about earlier, which for some reason, full disclosure, like there's like this huge block with journaling, but that's something that I'm working through because I know it's super beneficial. And I think that kind of goes back to, we were talking about, scaling where I thought I was from 1 to 10. And we talked about a few weeks ago that I was at a 6.
That's where you saw yourself.
Yeah. And the 4, 5, 6, remind me about that again.
So there are two scales, the 1 to 10 scale, which has to do with response and reactivity. And responding has to do with your core. You want to respond to people.
Yeah.
Your 4, 5, and 6, that's I call problem solving zone. And I think societally, we're not taught to be in problem solving zone. We are taught to shut our emotions down or hold them until we explode, right? And that exploding can be loud or it can be also silent. But if we can get to a 4, 5, and 6 problem-solving zone, we can hold that emotion and stay rational and then work off our core and problem-solving. So there's that scale. The other scale that we did was the 1 to 10 scale that has to do with our whole person. Where do I see myself developmentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, mentally? On a 1 to 10 scale, 10 being perfect, which I won't let anyone choose, right?
Yeah.
And 1 being dead. And you said 6.
Yeah.
And we talked about what are the goals with your 6, because that also can affect your relationship. So if you have those messages that you've adopted throughout your life from your traumas also, and you're at that 6, you're going to work off those goals. But if you attract maybe an 8, a person that's at an 8, they're pretty healthy developmentally in all those areas, we at some point will not feel good enough for that 8 if we're still that 6 and we start to sabotage. So if you can gauge where you are every day, because some days that's going to fluctuate. There's some days I feel like a 4.
Right.
But it's knowing, okay, I'm going to be back at my 8 tomorrow or my 7.
Yeah.
But if you know those goals, you can start working towards where you want to be, and that might be the 8. And what does that look like?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess where I was going with that is one of the things to get me from a 6 to 8 was doing the journaling.
Right.
The other thing was just letting myself go from a 6 to a 8, giving
Yes.
myself permission, because I can be really hard on myself. And I think that doesn't allow me to experience being an 8 sometimes.
I think you're right. You mentioned once fixing something, and I don't think it's really about fixing. I think it's finding our authentic and moving towards it and living in it,
Yeah.
and getting that framework, changing the framework, fixing something. We tend to psychologically punish ourselves. And what does 8 look like? Give yourself permission to move that direction, but also know what are you moving towards. Because if you don't know what that goal looks like, how do you know you're there?
Right. Oh, that's a good point. And again, that's why I love writing this stuff down. And I've so enjoyed the process of working with you. And it's only been 4 weeks.
Only 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Right?
So we
We've
still
a lot
got
done.